A book at bedtime. Milly Molly Mandy keeps shop. Once upon a time, Milly Molly Mandy was walking home from school with some little friends. Billy Blunt, Mrs. Muggins's niece Jilly, and of course little friend Susan. And they were all talking about what they would like to do when they were big. Billy Blunt said that he would have a motor bus and drive people to the station and pull their boxes about. Mrs. Muggins's Jilly said that she would curl her hair and be a lady who acts for the pictures. Little friend Susan wanted to be a nurse with long white streamers and push a pram with 2 babies in it. Milly Molly Mandy wanted a shop like Mrs. Muggins's, where she could sell sweets and cut pretty colored stuff for people's dresses with a big pair of scissors. And, "Oh dear," said Milly Molly Mandy, "I wish we didn't have to wait till we growed up." Then they came to Mrs. Muggins's shop, and Jilly said goodbye and went in. And then they came to Mr. Blunt's corn shop, which was only a few steps farther on, and Billy Blunt said goodbye and went in. And then Milly Molly Mandy and little friend Susan, with their arms round each other, walked up the white road with the field on each side till they came to the Moggs's cottage, and little friend Susan said goodbye and went in. And then Milly Molly Mandy went hoppity-skippiting on alone until she came to the nice white cottage with the thatched roof, where Mother was at the gate to meet her. Next day was Saturday, and Milly Molly Mandy went down to the village on an errand for Mother. And when she had done it, she saw Mrs. Muggins standing in her shop door, looking rather worried. And when Mrs. Muggins saw Milly Molly Mandy, she said, "Oh, Milly Molly Mandy, would you mind running to ask Mrs. Jakes if she could come and mind my shop for an hour? Tell her I've got to go see someone on very important business, and I don't know what to do, and Jilly's gone picnicking." So Milly Molly Mandy ran to ask Mrs. Jakes. But Mrs. Jakes said, "Tell Mrs. Muggins that I'm very sorry, but I've just got the cakes in the oven, and I can't leave them." So Milly Molly Mandy ran back and told Mrs. Muggins, and Mrs. Muggins said, "I wonder if Mrs. Blunt would come." But Mrs. Blunt said, "I'm sorry, but I'm simply up to my eyes in house cleaning, and I can't leave just now." So Milly Molly Mandy ran back and told Mrs. Muggins, and Mrs. Muggins said she didn't know of anyone else she could ask. Then Milly Molly Mandy said, "Oh, Mrs. Muggins, couldn't I look after the shop for you? I'll tell people you'll be back in an hour, and if they only want a sugar stick or something, I could give it to them. I know how much it is." Mrs. Muggins looked at Milly Molly Mandy, and then she said, "Well, you aren't very big, but I know you're careful, Milly Molly Mandy." So she gave her lots of instructions about asking people if they would come back in an hour, and not selling things unless she was quite sure of the price, and so on. And then Mrs. Muggins put on her hat and feather boa and hurried off. And Milly Molly Mandy was left alone in charge of the shop. Milly Molly Mandy felt very solemn and careful indeed. She dusted the counter with a duster which she saw hanging on a nail, and then she peeped into the window at all the handkerchiefs and socks and bottles of sweets, and she could see Mrs. Hubble arranging the loaves and cakes in her shop window opposite, and Mr. Smale, who had the grocer's shop with the little counter at the back where you posted parcels and bought stamps and letter paper, standing in his door enjoying the sunshine. And Milly Molly Mandy felt so pleased that she had a shop as well as they. And then suddenly the door handle rattled, and the little bell over the door jingle-jangled up and down, and who should come in but little friend Susan. And how little friend Susan did stare when she saw Milly Molly Mandy behind the counter. "Mrs. Muggins has gone out on important business, but she'll be back in an hour. What do you want?" said Milly Molly Mandy. "A packet of safety pins for Mother." "What are you doing here?" said little friend Susan. "I'm looking after the shop," said Milly Molly Mandy, "and I know where the safety pins are, because I had to buy some yesterday." So Milly Molly Mandy wrapped up the safety pins in a piece of thin brown paper and twisted the end just as Mrs. Muggins did, and she handed the packet to little friend Susan, and little friend Susan handed her a penny. And then little friend Susan wanted to stay and play shops with Milly Molly Mandy. But Milly Molly Mandy shook her head solemnly and said, "No, this isn't play, it's business. I've got to be very, very careful. You better go, Susan." And just then the bell jangled again, and a lady came in, so little friend Susan went out. She peered through the window for a long time to see how Milly Molly Mandy got on, but Milly Molly Mandy wouldn't look at her. The lady was Miss Bloss, who lived opposite over the baker's shop with Mrs. Bloss. She wanted 1/4 of a yard of pink flannelette because she was making a wrapper for her mother, and she hadn't bought quite enough for the collar. She said she didn't like to waste a whole hour till Mrs. Muggins returned. Milly Molly Mandy stood on one leg and wondered what to do, and Mrs. Bloss tapped with one finger and wondered what to do. Then Mrs. Bloss said, "That's the roll my flannelette came off. I'm quite sure Mrs. Muggins wouldn't mind my taking some." So between them they fetched off the pink flannelette, and Milly Molly Mandy fetched Mrs. Muggins's big scissors, and Mrs. Bloss made a crease exactly where the 1/4 yard came, and Milly Molly Mandy breathed very hard and cut slowly and carefully right up along the crease to the end. And then she wrapped the piece up and gave it to Miss Bloss, and Miss Bloss handed her 1/2 crown, saying, "Ask Miss Muggins to send me the change when she gets back." And then Miss Bloss went out. And then for a time nobody came in, and Milly Molly Mandy amused herself by trying to find the rolls of stuff that different people's dresses had come off. There was her own pink and white striped cotton, looking so lovely and new, and Mother's blue checked apron stuff, and Mrs. Jakes's Sunday gown. Then rattle went the handle, and jangle went the bell, and who should come in but Billy Blunt. "I'm Mrs. Muggins," said Milly Molly Mandy. "What do you want to buy?" "Where's Mrs. Muggins?" said Billy Blunt. So Milly Molly Mandy had to explain again. And then Billy Blunt said he wanted a penny's worth of aniseed balls. So Milly Molly Mandy stood on a box and reached down the glass jar from the shelf. They were 12 for a penny, she knew, for she had often bought them. So she counted them out, and then Billy Blunt counted them. And Billy Blunt said, "You've got one too many here." So Milly Molly Mandy counted again, and she found one too many too. So they dropped one back in the jar, and Milly Molly Mandy put the others into a little bag and swung it over by the corners, just as Mrs. Muggins did, and gave it to Billy Blunt. And Billy Blunt gave her his penny. And then Billy Blunt grinned and said, "Good morning, ma'am." And Milly Molly Mandy said, "Good morning, sir," and Billy Blunt went out. After that, an hour began to seem rather a long time, with the sun shining so outside. But at last the little bell gave a lively jangle again, and Mrs. Muggins had returned. And though Milly Molly Mandy had enjoyed herself very much, she thought perhaps, after all, she would rather wait until she was grown up before she kept a shop for herself. Continuing along with story number 9. Milly Molly Mandy Gives a Party. Once upon a time, Milly Molly Mandy had a plan. And when she had thought over the plan for a while, she went to look in her money box. And in the money box were 4 pennies and a halfpenny, which Milly Molly Mandy did not think would be enough for her plan. So Milly Molly Mandy went off to talk it over with little friend Susan down the road. "Susan," said Milly Molly Mandy, "I've got a plan, only it's a great secret. I want to give a party in our barn to Father and Mother and Grandpa and Grandma and Uncle and Auntie, and I want to buy refreshments, and you and I will be waitresses, and if there's anything over, we can eat it up afterwards." Little friend Susan thought it was a very good plan indeed. "Will we wear caps?" she asked. "Yes," said Milly Molly Mandy, "and aprons, only I haven't got enough money for the refreshments, so I don't think there'll be any over. We must think." So Milly Molly Mandy and little friend Susan sat down and thought hard. "We must work and earn some," said Milly Molly Mandy. "But how?" said little friend Susan. "We might sell something," said Milly Molly Mandy. "But what?" asked little friend Susan. So they had to think some more. Presently, Milly Molly Mandy said, "I've got pansies and marigolds in my garden." And little friend Susan said, "I've got nasturtiums in mine." "We could run errands for people," said Milly Molly Mandy. "And clean brass," said little friend Susan. That was a lovely idea. So Milly Molly Mandy fetched a pencil and a paper and wrote out very carefully, "Millicent, Margaret, and Amanda, and Susan and Co. have bunches of flowers for sale, and clean brass very cheap. We do not spill the polish, and run errands very cheap." "What's and Co.?" said little friend Susan. "It's just business," said Milly Molly Mandy, "but perhaps we might ask Billy Blunt to be in it, and then he could be a waiter." Then they hung the notice on the front gate, and waited just on the other side of the hedge. Several people passed, but nobody seemed to want anything. Then at last a motor car came along with a lady and a gentleman in it, and when they saw the nice white cottage with the thatched roof, they stopped at the gate to ask if they could get some cream there. Milly Molly Mandy said, "I'll go out and ask Mother," and took the little pot they held out. And when she came back with it full of cream, the lady and the gentleman had read the notice and were asking little friend Susan questions. As the lady paid for the cream, she said that they must certainly have some flowers. So they each bought a bunch. And then the gentleman said that the round brass thing in the front of his car needed cleaning very badly. Could the firm do it straight away? So Milly Molly Mandy said, "Yes, sir," and raced back to the cottage to give Mother the cream money and to borrow the brass polishing box. And then she cleaned the round brass thing in the front of the car with one piece of cloth, and little friend Susan rubbed it bright with another piece of cloth. And the lady and the gentleman looked on and seemed very satisfied. And then the gentleman asked how much, and paid them 2 pence for the flour and a penny for the polishing. Milly Molly Mandy wanted to do some more polishing for the money, but the gentleman said they couldn't stop. And then they said goodbye and went off, and the lady turned and waved, and Milly Molly Mandy and little friend Susan waved back until they were gone. Milly Molly Mandy and little friend Susan felt very happy and pleased. And now they had 7 pence halfpenny for the refreshments. Mother and father and grandpa and grandma and uncle and auntie and Mrs. Moggs, little friend Susan's mother, made 7. Then who should look over the hedge but Mr. Jakes the postman, on his way home from collecting letters from the letter boxes. He had seen the notice on the gate. "What's this? You trying to make a fortune?" said the postman. "Yes," said Milly Molly Mandy. "We've earned 3 pence." "My, what do you plan to do with it?" said the postman. "We've got a secret," said Milly Molly Mandy with a little skip. "Ah," said the postman. "Guess it's a nice one, too." Milly Molly Mandy looked at little friend Susan, and then she looked at the postman. He was a nice postman. "You won't tell if we tell you?" she asked. "Try me," said the postman promptly. So Milly Molly Mandy told him that they were planning to give a party to father and mother and grandpa and grandma and uncle and auntie and Mrs. Moggs. "They're in luck, they are," said the postman. "Nobody asked me to parties." Milly Molly Mandy looked at little friend Susan again, and then she looked at the postman. He was a very nice postman. Then she said, "Supposing you were invited, would you come?" "You try me," said the postman promptly again. And then he hitched up his letter bag and went on. "Father and mother and grandpa and grandma and uncle and auntie and Mrs. Moggs and the postman, we've got to earn some more," said Milly Molly Mandy. "Let's go down to the village and ask Billy Blunt to be the & Co., and perhaps he'll have an idea." Billy Blunt was in the road outside the corner shop, mending the handles of his box on wheels. He had made it nearly all himself, and it was a very nice one, painted green like the water butt and the lawn roller. He thought & Co. was rather a funny name, but he said he would be it all right, and offered to make them a box with a slit in it where they could keep their earnings. And then he put in 4 farthings out of his collection. Billy Blunt was collecting farthings. He had 19 in an empty birdseed bag. So now they had 8 pence halfpenny for the refreshments. On Monday morning, on their way home to dinner, Milly Molly Mandy and little friend Susan passed Mrs. Jakes, the postman's wife, at her door, getting a breath of fresh air before dishing up her dinner. And Mrs. Jakes said, "Good morning. How's the firm of Millicent, Margaret, Amanda, Susan & Co. getting on?" Milly Molly Mandy said, "Very well, thank you." "My husband's told me about your brass cleaning," said Mrs. Jakes. "I've got a whole mantel shelf full that wants doing." Milly Molly Mandy and little friend Susan were very pleased, and arranged to come in directly after school was over in the afternoon and clean it. And then they cleaned a mug and 3 candlesticks and 2 lamps, 1 big and 1 little, and a tray and a warming pan, and they didn't spill or waste any of the polish. Mrs. Jakes seemed very satisfied, and gave them each a penny and a piece of cake. So now they had 10 pence halfpenny for refreshments. But when they got outside, Milly Molly Mandy said, "Father and mother and grandpa and grandma and uncle and auntie and Mrs. Moggs and the postman and Mrs. Postman, I wonder if we've earned enough, Susan." As they turned home, they passed the forge. And of course they had to stop a moment at the doorway, as usual, to watch the fire roaring, and Mr. Rudge the blacksmith banging with a hammer on his anvil. Little friend Susan was just a bit nervous of the blacksmith. He was so big, and his face was so dirty it made his teeth look very white, and his eyes very twinkly when he smiled at them. But Milly Molly Mandy knew he was nice and clean under the dirt, which he couldn't help while he worked, so she smiled back. And the blacksmith said, "Hello," and Milly Molly Mandy said, "Hello." And the blacksmith beckoned with his fingers and said, "Come here." Milly Molly Mandy gave a little jump, and little friend Susan pulled at her hand, but Milly Molly Mandy knew he was really just a nice man under the dirt, so she went up to him. And the blacksmith said, "Look what I've got here," and he showed them a tiny little horseshoe, just like a proper one, only smaller, which he had made for them to keep. Milly Molly Mandy and little friend Susan were pleased. Milly Molly Mandy thanked him very much, and then she looked at the blacksmith and said, "If you were invited to a party, would you come?" And the blacksmith looked at Milly Molly Mandy with twinkly eyes and said he'd come quite fast. so long as it wasn't before 5 o'clock on Saturday, when he was playing cricket with his team in the meadow. When they got outside again, Milly Molly Mandy said, "Father and Mother and Grandpa and Grandma and Uncle and Auntie and Mrs. Moggs and the postman and Mrs. Postman and the blacksmith. We'll ask them for 5:30, and we ought to earn some more money, Susan." Just then they met Billy Blunt coming along, pulling his box on wheels with a bundle in it, and Billy Blunt grinned and said, "I'm fetching Mrs. Bloss's washing for the firm." Milly Molly Mandy and little friend Susan were pleased. Once Saturday morning came, all the invitations had been given out, and the firm of Millicent Margaret Amanda, Susan and Co. were very busy putting things tidy in the barn, and covering up things which couldn't be moved with lots of green branches which Grandpa was trimming from the hedges. And when 5:30 came, Milly Molly Mandy and little friend Susan, with clean hands and paper caps and aprons, waited by the barn door to welcome the guests. And each gentleman received a marigold buttonhole, and each lady a pansy. Everyone arrived in good time, except the blacksmith, who was just a little bit late. He looked so clean and pink in his white cricket flannels, Milly Molly Mandy hardly knew him. And Billy Blunt. But Billy Blunt came lugging a gramophone and 2 records which he had borrowed from a bigger boy at the school. He never told, but he had given the boy all the rest of his collection of farthings, 15 of them, which makes 3 pence 3 farthings, in exchange. Then Billy Blunt, who didn't want to dance, looked after the gramophone, while Father and Mother and Grandpa and Grandma and Uncle and Auntie and Mrs. Moggs and the postman and Mrs. Postman and the blacksmith and Milly Molly Mandy and little friend Susan danced together in the old barn till the dust flew. And Milly Molly Mandy danced a lot with the blacksmith as well as with everybody else, and so did little friend Susan. They did enjoy themselves. And then there were refreshments, raspberry drops and anisine balls on saucers trimmed with little flowers, and late blackberries on leaf plates, and sherbet drinks, which Billy Blunt prepared while Milly Molly Mandy and little friend Susan stood by to tell people just the very moment to drink, when it was fizzing properly. It was exciting. And a jelly which Milly Molly Mandy and little friend Susan had made themselves from a packet, only it had to be eaten rather like soup, as it wouldn't stand up properly. But Father and Mother and Grandpa and Grandma and Uncle and Auntie and Mrs. Moggs and the postman and Mrs. Postman and the blacksmith all said that they had never enjoyed a jelly so much. And the blacksmith, in a big voice, proposed a vote of thanks to the firm for the delightful party and refreshments, and everybody said "Hear, hear," and clapped. And Milly Molly Mandy and little friend Susan joined in the clapping too, which wasn't quite proper, but they were so happy that they couldn't help it. And then all the guests went home. And when the firm came to clear up the refreshments, they found that there was only 1 aniseed ball left. But placed among the empty saucers and glasses on the bench was a small basket of pears and a bag of mixed sweets, with a ticket for the waiter and waitresses on it. Chapter 10. Milly Molly Mandy Gets to Know Teacher. Once upon a time, there were changes at Milly Molly Mandy's school. Miss Shepherd, the headmistress, was going away, and Mrs. Edwards, the second teacher, was to be the headmistress in her place, and live in the teacher's cottage just by the school instead of coming in by the bus from the town each day. Miss Edwards was very strict, and taught arithmetic and history and geography and wore high collars. Milly Molly Mandy wasn't particularly interested in the change, though she liked both Miss Shepherd and Miss Edwards quite well. But one afternoon Miss Edwards gave her a note to give to her mother, and the note was to ask if Milly Molly Mandy's mother would be so very good as to let Miss Edwards have a bed at the nice white cottage with a thatched roof for a night or 2, until Miss Edwards could get her new little house straight. Father and Mother and Grandpa and Grandma and Uncle and Auntie talked it over during supper, and thought they might manage it for a few nights. Milly Molly Mandy was very interested, and tried to think what it would be like to have teachers sitting at supper with them, and going to sleep in the spare room as well as teaching in school all day. And she couldn't help but feel just a tiny bit glad that it was only to be for a night or 2. Next day she took a note to school for teacher from Mother to say yes, they would be pleased to have her. And after school, Milly Molly Mandy told little friend Susan and Billy Blunt about it. Little friend Susan said, "Ooh, won't you have to behave properly? I'm glad she's not coming to us." And Billy Blunt said, "Huh, hard lines." Milly Molly Mandy was quite glad teacher was only coming to stay for a few nights. Miss Edwards arrived at the nice white cottage with the thatched roof just before supper time the following evening. Milly Molly Mandy was looking out for her, and directly she heard the gate click, she called Mother and ran and opened the front door wide so that the hall lamp could shine down the path. And teacher came in out of the dark just as Mother hurried from the kitchen to welcome her. Teacher thanked Mother very much for having her, and said she felt so dusty and untidy because she had been putting up shelves in her new little cottage ever since school was over. So Mother said, "Come right up to your room, Miss Edwards, and Milly-Molly-Mandy will bring you a jug of hot water, and then I expect you'll be glad of some supper straight away." So Milly-Molly-Mandy ran along to the kitchen for a jug of hot water, thinking about how funny it was to hear Teacher's familiar voice away from school. She tapped very politely at the half-open door of the spare room. She could see Teacher tidying her hair in front of the dressing table by candlelight. And Teacher smiled at her as she took the steaming jug and said, "That's very kind of you, Milly-Molly-Mandy. This is just what I want most. What a lovely smell of hotcakes." Milly-Molly-Mandy smiled back, and she was quite a bit surprised that Teacher should speak in that pleased, hungry sort of way. It was more the kind of way that she or little friend Susan or father and mother or grandpa and grandma or uncle or auntie might have spoken. When Teacher came downstairs to the kitchen, they all sat down to supper. Teacher's place was just opposite Milly-Molly-Mandy's, and every time she caught Milly-Molly-Mandy's eye, she smiled across at her. And Milly-Molly-Mandy smiled back and tried to remember to sit up, for she kept on almost expecting Teacher to say, "Head up, Milly-Molly-Mandy! Keep your elbows off the desk." But she never did. They were all a little shy of Teacher, just at first, but soon Father and Mother and Grandpa and Grandma and Uncle and Auntie were talking away, and Teacher was talking too and laughing. And she looked so different when she was laughing that Milly-Molly-Mandy found it quite difficult to get on with her bread and milk before it got cold. Teacher enjoyed the hotcakes and wanted to know just how Mother made them. She asked a lot of questions, and Mother said she would teach Teacher how to do it, so that she could make them in her own new little kitchen. Milly-Molly-Mandy thought how funny it would be for Teacher to start having lessons. After supper, Teacher asked Milly-Molly-Mandy if she could make little sailor girls. And when Milly-Molly-Mandy said no, Teacher drew a little sailor girl with a sailor collar and a sailor hat and pleated skirt on a folded piece of paper, and then she cut it out with Auntie's scissors. And when she unfolded the paper, there was a whole row of little sailor girls all holding hands. Milly-Molly-Mandy did like it. She thought how funny it was that she should have known Teacher all this time and never known that she could draw little sailor girls. Then Mother said, "Now, Milly-Molly-Mandy, it is bedtime." So Milly-Molly-Mandy kissed Father and Mother and Grandpa and Grandma and Uncle and Auntie and went to shake hands with Teacher. But Teacher said she wanted a kiss too, so they kissed each other in quite a nice, friendly way. But still Milly-Molly-Mandy felt when she went upstairs she must get into bed extra quickly and quietly because Teacher was in the house. The next morning, Milly-Molly-Mandy and Teacher went to school together. And as soon as they got there, Teacher was just her usual self again and told Milly-Molly-Mandy to sit up or to get on with her work as if she had never laughed at supper or cut out little sailor girls or kissed anyone goodnight. After school, Milly-Molly-Mandy showed little friend Susan and Billy Blunt the role of little sailor girls. Little friend Susan opened her eyes and said, "Just fancy Teacher doing that." And Billy Blunt folded them up very carefully in the creases so that he could see how they were made. And then he grinned and gave them back. And little friend Susan and Billy Blunt didn't feel so very sorry for Milly-Molly-Mandy having Teacher to stay then. That evening, Teacher came up to the nice white cottage with the thatched roof earlier than she did the day before. And when Milly-Molly-Mandy came into the kitchen from taking out a nice meal to Toby the dog and giving him a good bedtime romp round the yard, what should she see but Teacher, with one of Mother's big aprons on, and her sleeves tucked up, learning how to make apple turnovers for supper. And Mother was saying always mix the pastry with a light hand, and Teacher was looking so interested, and didn't seem to the least to know she had a streak of flour down one cheek. When Teacher saw Milly-Molly-Mandy, she said, "Come along, Milly-Molly-Mandy, and have a cooking lesson with me. It's such fun." So Milly-Molly-Mandy's mother gave her a little piece of dough, and she stood by Teacher's side, rolling it out and making it into a ball again. But she was much more interested in watching Teacher be taught. And Teacher did everything she was told, and tried so hard that her cheeks got quite pink. When the turnovers were all made, there was a small piece of dough left on the board. So Teacher shaped it into the most beautiful little bird, and the bird and the turnovers were popped into the oven along with Milly-Molly-Mandy's piece, which had been a pig and a cat and a teapot, but ended up a little gray loaf. When Father and Mother and Grandpa and Grandma and Uncle and Auntie and Teacher and Milly-Molly-Mandy sat down to supper, Teacher put her fingers to her lips to Milly-Molly-Mandy when the apple turnovers came out, so that Milly-Molly-Mandy shouldn't tell who had made them until they had been tasted. And Teacher watched anxiously, and presently Mother said, "How do you like these turnovers?" And everyone said they were most delicious, and then Milly-Molly-Mandy couldn't wait any longer, and she called out, "Teacher made them!" And everybody was so surprised. Milly-Molly-Mandy didn't eat the little gray-brown loaf because she didn't quite fancy it. Toby the dog did, though. And she felt that she couldn't eat the little golden-brown bird because it really looked too good to just be eaten yet. So she took it to school with her the next day to share with little friend Susan and Billy Blunt. And little friend Susan said, "Isn't it pretty? Isn't Teacher clever?" And Billy Blunt said, "Fancy Teacher playing with dough." Little friends Susan and Billy Blunt didn't feel sorry at all for Milly Molly Mandy then, having teacher to stay with her. The next day was Saturday, and teacher's furniture had come, and she was busy all day arranging it and getting the curtains and the pictures up, and Milly Molly Mandy with little friend Susan and Billy Blunt came in the afternoon to help. And they ran up and down the stairs and fetched hammers and nails and held things and made themselves very useful indeed. And at 4 o'clock teacher sent Billy Blunt out to get some cakes from Mrs. Hubbell's shop, while the others laid the table in the pretty little sitting room. And they did a nice kind of picnic, with Milly Molly Mandy and little friend Susan sharing a cup, and Billy Blunt having a saucer for a plate, because everything wasn't unpacked yet. And they all laughed and talked, and were as happy as anything, and when teacher said it was time to send them all off home, Milly Molly Mandy was so sorry to think that teacher wasn't to come sleep in the spare room anymore, that she wanted to kiss teacher without being asked, and she actually did it too, and little friend Susan and Billy Blunt didn't look a bit surprised either. And after that, somehow, it didn't seem to matter that teacher was strict in school, for they knew that she was really just a nice, usual sort of person inside all of the time. So now we're on chapter 11. Oh, I like this one. Milly Molly Mandy goes to a fête. Once upon a time, while Milly Molly Mandy was shopping in the village for mother, she saw a poster on a board outside Mr. Blunt's corn shop. So she stopped to read it, and she found out that there was to be a fête held in the playing field with sports and competitions for children, and other things for grown-ups. And while she was reading, Billy Blunt looked out of the shop door. And Milly Molly Mandy said, "Hello, Billy." And Billy Blunt grinned and said, "Hello, Milly Molly Mandy." And he came and looked at the poster too. "When's the fête to be?" said Milly Molly Mandy. And Billy Blunt pointed with his toe to the date. And then he pointed to the words, 100-yard races, 3-legged races, etc., and said, "I'm going in for them." "Are you?" said Milly Molly Mandy, and began to be interested. She thought a fête would be quite fun, and decided to ask Mother when she got home if she might go to it too. A day or two later, as Milly Molly Mandy was swinging on the meadow gate after school, she saw someone running along in the middle of the road in a very steady, businesslike fashion. And who should it be but Billy Blunt? "Hello, Billy. Where are you going?" said Milly Molly Mandy. Billy Blunt slowed up and wiped his forehead, panting. "I'm getting into training," said Billy Blunt, "for the races." Milly Molly Mandy thought that was a very good idea. "I'm going to do some running every day," said Billy Blunt, "till the fête." Milly Molly Mandy was sure Billy Blunt would win. And then Billy Blunt asked if Milly Molly Mandy could count minutes, because it would be nice to have someone time his running sometimes. Milly Molly Mandy couldn't because she had never tried. But after that, she practiced counting minutes with the kitchen clock, till she got to know just about how fast to count to 60, so that it was almost exactly a minute. And then the next day, Billy Blunt stood right at one end of the meadow by the nice white cottage with the thatched roof, where Milly Molly Mandy lived, and Milly Molly Mandy stood at the other end, and when Billy Blunt shouted go and began running, Milly Molly Mandy shut her eyes tight so that she wouldn't think of anything else, and began counting steadily. And Billy Blunt reached her side in just over a minute and a half. They did it several times, but Billy Blunt couldn't manage to do it in less time. And after that, they tied their ankles together, Billy Blunt's left and Milly Molly Mandy's right, with Billy Blunt's scarf, and practiced running with 3 legs across the field. It was such fun, and Milly Molly Mandy shouted with laughter sometimes because they just couldn't help falling over. But Billy Blunt was rather solemn, and very keen to do it properly, although even he couldn't keep from letting out a laugh now and then when they got very entangled. By the time of the fête, Billy Blunt was able to get across the meadow in a little over a minute, and their 3-legged running was really quite good, so that they were full of hope for winning some prizes in the sports. The day of the fête was nice and fine, even if not very warm, but Billy Blunt said it was just as well to have it a little bit cool for the sports. As it was bank holiday, nearly everybody in the village showed up, paying their 6 pences at the gate and admiring the flags and saying hello or how do you do to each other. Milly Molly Mandy went with her father and mother and grandpa and grandma and uncle and auntie, and little friend Susan was there with her mother, who was also looking after Mrs. Muggins's niece Jilly, as Mrs. Muggins didn't much care for fêtes. And Mr. Jakes, the postman, was there with his wife, and Mr. Rudge, the blacksmith, in his Sunday suit. There were coconut sheaves. Uncle won a coconut. And throwing little hoops, 3 throws a penny, over things spread out on a table. Mother got a pocket comb, but she tried to get an alarm clock. And lots of other fun things. Then the children's sports began. Milly Molly Mandy paid a penny for a try at walking along a very narrow board to reach a red balloon at the other end. But she toppled off before she got it, and everybody laughed. Mrs. Muggins's Jilly got the balloon. Then they entered for the 3-legged race. little friend Susan and Mrs. Muggins' Jilly together, and Milly Molly Mandy and Billy Blunt because they had practiced, and a whole row of other boys and girls. A man tied their ankles and shouted, "Go!" and off they all started, and everybody laughed and couples kept stumbling and tumbling round, but Milly Molly Mandy and Billy Blunt careered steadily along till they reached the winning post. Then everybody laughed and clapped like anything, and Billy Blunt pulled the string from round their ankles in a great hurry and cleared off, and Milly Molly Mandy had to take his box of chocolates for him as well as her own. Then there was the 100-yard race for the boys. There was one rather shabbily dressed little boy who had stood looking on at all the games. So Father asked him if didn't he want to join in, and he said he didn't have any money. So Father paid for him to join the race, and he was so pleased. A man shouted "Go!" and off went all the boys in a mass, and how they did run! Milly Molly Mandy was so excited that she had to keep jumping up and down. But Billy Blunt presently got a little bit ahead of the others. Milly Molly Mandy held herself tight, and then he got a little bit farther, and so did the shabby boy, only not so far as Billy Blunt. And then Billy Blunt saw him out of the corner of his eyes as he ran, and then the race was over, and somehow the shabby boy had won, and he got a striped tin of toffee. And Billy Blunt grinned at the shabby boy, who looked so happy hugging his tin of toffee, and asked his name and where he lived, and would he come and practice racing with him in the meadow next Saturday. The next day, as Milly Molly Mandy and Billy Blunt and one or two others were coming home from school, they saw a big man with a suitcase waiting at the crossroads for the bus, which went every hour into town. And just as the bus came into sight, the man's hat blew off away down the road ever such a distance. The man looked for it for a moment, as if he didn't know what to do, and then he caught sight of them and shouted, "Hey, can any of you youngsters run?" And Milly Molly Mandy said, "Billy Blunt can," and instantly off went Billy Blunt down the road in his best racing style, and just as the bus pulled up at the stopping place, he picked up the hat and came tearing back with it. "I should just say you can run," said the man. "You've saved me an hour's wait for the next bus, and a whole lot of business besides." "What a good thing you were in training," said Milly Molly Mandy to Billy Blunt as the bus ran off. "Ha! More sense that than just racing," said Billy Blunt, putting his hair straight. Chapter 12. Milly Molly Mandy Has a Surprise. Once upon a time, Milly Molly Mandy was helping Mother to fetch some pots of jam down from the little storeroom. Father and Mother and Grandpa and Grandma and Uncle and Auntie and Milly Molly Mandy between them ate quite a lot of jam. So Mother, who made all the jam, had to keep the pots upstairs because the kitchen cupboard wouldn't hold them all. The little storeroom was up under the thatched roof, and it had a little square window very near to the floor, and the ceiling sloped away on each side so that Father and Mother or Grandpa or Grandma or Uncle or Auntie could stand upright only in the very middle of the room. But Milly Molly Mandy could stand upright anywhere in it. When Mother and Milly Molly Mandy had found the jams they wanted, strawberry jam and blackberry jam and ginger jam, Mother looked round the little storeroom and said, "It's a pity I haven't got somewhere else to keep my jam pots." Milly Molly Mandy said, "Why, Mother? I think this is a very nice place for jam pots to live in." And Mother said, "Do you?" But a few days later, Father and Mother went up to the little storeroom together and took out all the little jam pots and all the shelves that held the jam pots, and Father stood them down in the new shed he was making outside the back door, while Mother started cleaning out the little storeroom. And Milly Molly Mandy helped them by washing the little square window so that my jam pots can see out, Mother said. The next day Milly Molly Mandy came upon Father in the barn mixing color wash up in a bucket. It was a pretty color, just like a pale new primrose, and Milly Molly Mandy dabbled in it with a little bit of stick for a while. And then she asked what it was for. And Father said, "I'm going to do over the walls and the ceiling of the little storeroom with it." And then he added, "Don't you think it will make the jam pots feel nice and cheerful?" Milly Molly Mandy said she was sure the jam pots would just love it. It was such fun. A little while afterwards, Mother sent Milly Molly Mandy to the village to buy a packet of green dye at Mr. Smale the grocer's shop. And then Mother dyed some of the old casement curtains a bright green for the little storeroom window because, said Mother, the window looks so bare from the outside. And while she was about it, she said she might as well dye the coverlet on Milly Molly Mandy's little cot bed, which stood in one corner of Father and Mother's room, as the pattern had washed nearly white. So Milly Molly Mandy had a nice new bedspread instead of a faded old one. The next Saturday, when Grandpa came home from the market, he brought with him in the back of the pony trap a little chest of drawers, which he said he had picked up cheap. He thought it might come in useful for storing things in the little storeroom. And Mother said yes, it would come in very useful indeed. So, as it was rather shabby, Uncle, who had been painting the door of the new shed with apple green paint, painted the little chest of drawers green too, so that it was a very pretty little chest of drawers indeed. "Well," said Uncle, "that ought to make any jam pot taste sweet." Milly Molly Mandy began to think the little storeroom would be almost too good just for jam pots. And then Auntie decided that she and Uncle wanted a new mirror in their room, and she asked Mother if their old little one couldn't be stored up in the little storeroom. And when Mother said it could, Uncle said he might as well use up the last of the green paint, so that he could throw away the tin. So he painted the frame of the mirror green. It looked a very pretty little mirror indeed. "Jam pots don't want to look at themselves," said Milly Molly Mandy. She thought the mirror looked much too pretty for the little storeroom. "Oh well, a mirror helps to make the room lighter," said Mother. Then Milly Molly Mandy came upon Grandma embroidering a pretty little wool bird on either end of a strip of coarse linen. It was a robin with a brown back and a scarlet front. Milly Molly Mandy thought it was a pretty cloth, and she wanted to know what it was for. And Grandma said, "I just thought it would look nice in the little chest of drawers in the little storeroom." And then she added, "It might amuse the jam pots." And Milly Molly Mandy laughed and begged Grandma to tell her what the pretty cloth really was for, but Grandma would only chuckle and say it was to amuse the jam pots. The next day, when Milly Molly Mandy came home from school, Mother said, "Milly Molly Mandy, we've got the little storeroom in order again. Now, would you please run up and fetch me a pot of jam?" And Milly Molly Mandy said, "Yes, Mother, what sort?" And Father said blackberry, and Grandma said red currant, and Grandpa said marrow ginger, and Uncle said strawberry, and Auntie said raspberry, but Mother said any sort you like, Milly Molly Mandy. Milly Molly Mandy thought something funny must be going to happen. For Father and Mother and Grandpa and Grandma and Uncle and Auntie all looked as if they had got a laugh down inside them. But she ran upstairs to the little storeroom, and when she opened the door she saw her own little cot bed with the green coverlet on just inside, and the little square window with the green curtains blowing out in the wind, and a little yellow pot of nasturtiums on the sill, and the little green chest of drawers with the robin cloth on it, and the little green mirror hanging on the primrose wall with Milly Molly Mandy's own face reflected in it. And then Milly Molly Mandy knew that the storeroom was to be her very own little bedroom, and she said, "Oh!" in a very hushed voice, as she looked all round her room. And then suddenly she tore back downstairs into the kitchen and just hugged Father and Mother and Grandpa and Grandma and Uncle and Auntie, and they all said that she was their favorite jam pot and pretended to eat her up. And Milly Molly Mandy didn't know how to wait till bedtime, because she was so eager to go to sleep in the little room that was her very own. Aww, I love that one. I love that one. One more. Okay. Chapter 13. Milly Molly Mandy Goes to a Concert. Once upon a time, Milly Molly Mandy was going to a grown-up concert, with Father and Mother and Grandpa and Grandma and Uncle and Auntie. They had all got their tickets. It was to be held in the Village Institute at 7 o'clock, and it wouldn't be over until quite 9 o'clock, which was lovely and late for Milly Molly Mandy. But you see, this wasn't like an ordinary concert, where people you didn't know sang and did things. It was quite an extra specially important concert, for Auntie was going to play the piano on the platform, and the young lady who helped Mrs. Hubble in her baker's shop was going to sing, and some other people whom Milly Molly Mandy had heard spoken of were going to do things too. So it was very exciting indeed. Auntie had a new mauve silk scarf for her neck, and a newly trimmed hat, and her handkerchief was sprinkled with the lavender water that Milly Molly Mandy had given her last Christmas. Milly Molly Mandy felt so proud that it was to be used for such a special occasion. Auntie put a drop on Milly Molly Mandy's own handkerchief too. When they had all got into their best clothes and shoes, they said goodbye to Toby the dog and Topsy the cat, and started off for the village, Father and Mother and Grandpa and Grandma and Uncle and Auntie and Milly Molly Mandy. And they were as nearly as possible forgot to take their tickets off the mantelpiece, but Mother remembered just in time. There were several people already in their seats when Father and Mother and Grandpa and Grandma and Uncle and Auntie and Milly Molly Mandy got to the Institute. Mrs. and Mrs. Hubble and the young lady who helped them were just in front, and Mr. and Mrs. Blunt and Mr. and Mrs. Moggs, little friend Susan's father and mother, were just behind. Billy Blunt and little friend Susan weren't there, but then they hadn't got an auntie who was going to play on the platform, so it wasn't as important for them to be up late. The platform looked very nice, with plants in crinkly green paper, and the piano was standing there all ready for Auntie. People were coming in very fast, and it wasn't long before the hall was full, everybody was talking and rustling programs, then people started clapping, and Milly Molly Mandy saw that some ladies and gentlemen with violins and things were going up to the steps on the platform with very solemn faces. A lady hit 1 or 2 notes on the piano, and people with violins played a lot of funny noises, without taking any notice of each other. Mother said they were tuning up, and then they all started off playing properly. And the concert had begun. Milly Molly Mandy did enjoy it. She clapped as hard as ever she could, and so did everybody else when the music stopped. After that, people sang one at a time, or a lot at a time, or played the piano, and one man sang a funny song, which made Milly Molly Mandy laugh, and everyone else too. But Milly Molly Mandy was longing for the time to come for Auntie to play. She was just asking Mother in a whisper when Auntie was going to play, when she heard a queer little sound, just like a dog walking on the wooden floor. And she looked round and saw people in the back of the hall glancing down, here and there, smiling and pointing, and presently what should she feel but a cold, wet nose on her leg, and what should she see but a white, furry object coming out from under her chair? And then there was Toby the dog, without a ticket, looking just as pleased with himself as he could be for having found them. Milly Molly Mandy was very shocked at him, and so was Mother. She said, "Naughty Toby," in a whisper, and Father pushed him under the seat and made him lie down. They couldn't disturb the concert by taking him out just then. So Toby stayed there and heard the concert without a ticket. And now and then Milly Molly Mandy put her hand down and Toby the dog licked it and half got up to wag his tail. But Father said shh, so Milly Molly Mandy put her hand back in her lap and Toby the dog settled down again. But they liked being near each other. Then the time came for the young lady who helped Mrs. Hubble to sing and Auntie to play for her. So the young lady got up and dropped her handbag, and Auntie got up and dropped her music. It made Toby the dog jump. But they were picked up again, and then Auntie and the young lady went up onto the platform. And who do you think went up with them? Why, Toby the dog, looking just as if he thought Auntie had meant him to follow. Everybody laughed, and Auntie pointed to Toby the dog to go down again. But Toby the dog didn't seem to understand, and he got behind the piano and wouldn't come out. So Auntie had to play, and the young lady had to sing, with Toby the dog peeping out now and then from behind the piano, and everybody tried not to notice him, lest it should make them laugh. But still, Auntie played beautifully, and the young lady sang, and Milly Molly Mandy clapped as hard as she could, and so did everybody else when the song was finished. In fact, they all clapped so loud that Toby the dog gave a surprised bark, and everybody laughed again. Then they had another try to get Toby the dog off the platform, but Toby the dog wouldn't come. Then Father said, "Milly Molly Mandy, see if you can go and get him." So Milly Molly Mandy slipped off her seat past the people's knees and climbed up onto the steps to the platform in front of all the audience, and she said, "Toby, come here," round the corner of the piano. And Toby the dog put out his nose and sniffed her hand, and Milly Molly Mandy was able to catch hold of his collar and pull him out. She walked right across the platform with Toby the dog in her arms, and everybody laughed, and somebody, I think it was the blacksmith, called out, "Bravo, encore!" and clapped. And Milly Molly Mandy, feeling very hot, hurried down the steps, with Toby the dog licking all over one side of her cheek and hair. There was only a little bit of the concert to come after that, so Milly Molly Mandy stood at the back of the hall with Toby the dog till it was finished. Then everybody started crowding to the door. Most of them smiled at Milly Molly Mandy and Toby the dog as they stood waiting for Father and Mother and Grandpa and Grandma and Uncle and Auntie to come. Mr. Jakes the postman, passing with Mrs. Jakes, said, "Well, well, I didn't expect to see you turning out a public character just yet a while, young lady." And Milly Molly Mandy laughed with Mr. Jakes. Then Mr. Rudge, the blacksmith, passed, and he said solemnly, "You and Toby gave us a very fine performance indeed. If I'd have known beforehand, I'd have sent you up a bouquet each." Milly Molly Mandy liked the blacksmith. He was a nice man. "Well," said Auntie as they all walked home together in the dark, "I think if we'd known Toby was going to perform up on the platform tonight, we'd have given him a bath and a new collar first." You have been listening to Story Ranger Presents A Book at Bedtime. Tonight, we read the Milly Molly Mandy Storybook by Joyce Lankester Brisley. Have a great day and a great rest of your week. Bye! Blah!